Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight for the virtual release of Eye to Eye Portraits of Lesbians. My name is Casey, and I'm with Anthology Editions. For those of you who don't know us, we're an independent book publisher based in Brooklyn, New York. We specialize in books on music, art, pop culture, and of course, photography. Tonight, we're joined by the incomparable JEB and Sarah Schulman. For a little background, Joan Biren, better known as JEB, is an internationally recognized documentary artist and activist. She began to chronicle the lives of LGBTQ plus people in 1971, publishing groundbreaking books and making award-winning films. In 1979, JEB self-released her first book, Eye to Eye Portraits of Lesbians, a pivotal work that documented the everyday lives of lesbians living in the United States. Now, 40 years later, we're honored to be able to give this new life in such an important trailblazing piece of history. The new edition features additional essays from artist and writer Tee Corinne, former World Cup soccer player Lori Lindsey, and photographer Lola Flash, who I believe is on with us right now. Sarah Schulman is a novelist, nonfiction writer, playwright, screenwriter, and AIDS historian. Her new book, Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993, will be released this May. We will put a link to pre-order her book in the chat shortly. Before we get started tonight, I want to mention that you can purchase Eye to Eye in the link below. All orders placed this evening will receive a signed copy of the book by JEB. Please allow us a couple extra days for processing and shipping these books. If you have questions during the event, please feel free to ask them in the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of the page, and we'll try our best to answer all of your questions at the end of the conversation. Tonight's talk will be recorded and available for viewing on the Anthology Editions Crowdcast page, and the link will also be posted in the chat. And now, without further delay, I'm thrilled to introduce you to JEB.
Hi, I am JEB, Joan Biren, and first of all, I wanted to thank Sarah for agreeing to do this with me. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you, Sarah. I want to thank Casey for the introduction, and I want to thank all of you for coming, and to tell you I can't see the chat, so I'm not going to be responding directly, but my friend Debbie Richards is going to be putting some links in there for you. And we're going to be taking questions maybe as we go along, but definitely at the end. And without further ado, the really honest to goodness incomparable Sarah Schulman. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. It's such an honor to be here with you. You and your colleagues made my life possible and the lives of many people who are here tonight, many of whom are also visual artists. Because of you and your friends, when I came out in 1975, I not only had an already pre-existing subculture to come out into, but it was already being represented because of people like you. So I want to start with some questions. I know that when an artist decides to have lesbian content in their work, you gain a lot, but you also give up a lot. Urvashi Vad says lesbian content is the kiss of death professionally. That's a quote I always like to use. But one of the things that you lose is that people don't ever look at your work in terms of its historical context or its aesthetic traditions. The lesbian content seems to overshadow everything and you get decontextualized. So I really want to go back to your beginnings as an artist and where you first saw photography, how you felt that that was your art form, and what kind of artwork really impressed you when you were young.
That's a lot of questions at once. Let me just say that I agree with you that one of the problems of being a lesbian artist is that you don't get put into a context. And part of what I've been trying to do now that Eye to Eye is being reissued is explain what the context was that it was made in. You know, how hard it is to convince people that there weren't any images at that time. Younger people have trouble imagining the complete lack that existed. And I started making photographs because I wanted them and I couldn't find them, literally.
So being a lesbian is what made you become a photographer?
Yes, because I was supposed to be political and be an organizer. And I was in this collective called the Furies. And I had just come from undergraduate studies and graduate studies at Oxford University. And I was very good at arguing, also because I come from a Jewish home. I was very good at arguing. I was very good with my words. And the people in the collective wanted me not to use my words. You know how you say to little children, use your words? They said to me, don't use your words. So I had to find another tool part of the reason they said don't use your words, which I understood, was that I had had such a privileged education, I was polluted in my mind. My mind had been colonized, by the patriarchal education that I had. So I didn't think I was very artistic, but I gave photography a try and I fell in love with it. I really loved, being a photographer once I got going.
But when you were younger, what kind of artwork attracted you? Who were some of the artists that you think influenced you?
Well, when I was young, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my parents, I remember, I think, being in a stroller, being pushed around the National Gallery of Art. My parents really loved art. And so I think I was influenced by everything. But when I think about what actually influenced me, and I'm going to ask Casey to put up here number 17, and then we'll do 18 and 19. At the time that I decided to become a photographer, what was influencing me was the photojournalistic documentary tradition, because I wanted to make photographs in order to make political change. So I was looking at the photographs that were having a huge impact. Well, let's go back. Can we go back? The first one, this is by Bill Hudson. It's from 1963, when Bull Connor, the terrible racist, was using attack dogs and fire hoses on civil rights demonstrators. And these pictures, which were on the front page of the New York Times, made a big impact. And now we can go to the next one. This one is by a photographer named W. Eugene Smith. And he went to Japan to a place called Minamata, where there was mercury poisoning. And he wanted to show the effect of the poisoning. And this young daughter, Tomiko, was being given a bath. I think this is a beautiful photograph, and it influenced me a lot to know that you could have a beautiful photograph that also could have a political impact. And then we can go to the last one. This one, which is called Napalm Girl, which was taken by Nick Ut during the Vietnam War, also was on the front page of the New York Times and had a big impact in terms of rallying opinion against the Vietnam War. Thanks, Casey. So this kind of photojournalism was what affected me at the very beginning, because at the very beginning, I didn't know there had been lesbian photographers. And then subsequently, I found them and they had a great influence on me from there on. But in the beginning, I was, modeling myself after people like that, and Lewis Hine, who did the child laborers in the mills and so on.
But it's interesting that you say, see, I wouldn't have guessed that, because your self-published book is not about activism, and it's not about oppression. It's about subculture. And it's about the creation of lesbian reality. And it reminded me quite a bit of WPA photography and this kind of socialist photography of the people. But you're expanding that to include lesbians. And I was just wondering what your take is on that.
Well, the WPA photographers, especially, of course, Dorothea Lange, I knew their work, but I didn't relate to it in that way, even though, of course, you're right. There was, at the time, there was no movement like that to go out and photograph exactly. I did that in my second book, Making Away Lesbians Out Front, which was published in 1987. That is the book that shows the movement. It's also a subculture book. It's all about everything that we created. But the first book was really a hey, we exist book, Lesbians exist, we're real, and we don't look like any of the representations that you've seen up until now.
Well, I wanted to ask you about some of the specific elements of subculture that you represent so well. One of them is the Back to the Land movement.
Yeah.
Which, I was involved with the early times of the Michigan Women's Music Festival. I left when they had the anti-trans policy. But you show women living in the woods, building houses.
Yeah.
When did you become aware of the lesbian Back to the Land movement?
We could show number 11. When I decided to make this book, and I thought it would be the only book I would ever make in my life, that I knew if I just photographed people that I already knew, it wouldn't be the kind of book I wanted it to be. So I started going around and asking people to introduce me, and I got passed by word of mouth, to friends and friends of friends. And eventually, in this case, I ended up in a little town called Willits, California. And this woman, Jane Gurko, who was Sally Gerhardt's partner at the time, they were building their little place in the middle of nowhere. And I became aware of the Back to the Land movement when I started asking people, where are the lesbians who don't live in the cities?
Because, there were women's land.
Yes.
Was very widespread. You could go from coast to coast and stay at women's land all across the country. There were thousands of people involved in that phenomena. There's very little documentation of it now.
And I did that. And not only that, I also, I taught at Women's Land at Rootworks in Oregon. We had the photography ovulars, where we had lesbian photographers come from all over the country, come together, and that was on women's land. And Oregon had tons of women's land, and I think that is probably the most documented right now.
Some other things that what's now called polyamory.
Yes.
Is something that you document as well as part of lesbian subculture. Can you talk about what sexual values were at the time and how you negotiated with people to represent their relationships and their sexualities?
I think I didn't do a great job of representing sexualities because I was sort of focused on not having a book of couples because I wanted people to understand you didn't have to be in a couple to be a lesbian, which was sort of the predominant feeling at the time. So there are a lot of individuals in the book. And there's, Tee was my mentor and my dear friend, and she was all about sexuality. So in a way, it took it off me. I didn't have to do sexuality because Tee did such a great job of it. But I have always felt that it was important to, the polyamory, which there was in Eye to Eye, there is this threesome, this older threesome. And I wanted them there because not only had I personally been in all kinds of different configurations of relationships, but again, it was just a way of saying there are a lot of different ways to do this. And I think at that time, as you will remember, we were all about smashing the nuclear family and not having monogamous relationships. And, we had just come out of the 60s, which was all about free love. And there was still a lot of that in the air, I think.
Well, also it has communist roots as well. I mean, there's collective living, there's sharing of wealth, there's open sexuality, there was vegetarianism.
Yeah.
There was interest in alternative religious perspectives. It was a very, very much a continuation of not just the 60s, but the 30s.
Yeah, exactly. And I lived collectively for many, many years. And partly because we had no money, because we were all doing our activism or our art, neither of which made any money. So living collectively was made sense in that way. But really, we did it because we believed that sharing resources was the right thing to do.
So I just want to talk about some of your colleagues, some peer lesbian photographers, some of whom are no longer with us. You brought up Tee Corinne, who's incredibly important in this period. Yeah. Can you tell us how you met her and what it was like to deal with her? I interacted with her a little bit as well.
I hate the how did you meet people question because my memory is not good.
Well, let me ask you, did you know her work before you knew her?
I have no idea.
Okay, go for it.
I will talk to you about Tee because Tee is hard to forget. And she was hugely important to me. Tee was a Southern femme who flirted with me like you would not believe. And I was so uncomfortable with it. I really did not know how to deal with her flirting. But we became very good friends. She helped me enormously because she considered herself an artist and she knew about the art world, and she is the only person for years who actually looked at my work and looked at it as art and said to me, wow, you have this classical style, and I thought, wow, I have a style. Who knew, and she told me if I was going to travel, I needed to get a slideshow because she already had a slideshow about erotic images from all over the world. And I put together my slideshow about lesbian photography. And, Tee was very, very supportive of other photographers. She, brought us together, not only at the Ovular, but she wrote about us and she encouraged us. And I hope that she is going to get more recognition. And I know some people are working on a book about her, and I'm going to be contributing to that. But really, such an important figure for lesbian photography.
And what about Honey Lee Cottrell?
Well, Honey Lee and Tee were lovers early on, and I think that was a very, one of those relationships that made both of them more productive, and they worked together and created these erotic photographs. And Honey Lee's work is now at the Cornell Archives, the Human Sexuality Collection, and Tee's work is at the University of Oregon. So both of their works are, one of the other things Tee did was she convinced me I had to get my stuff together and put my work in order so that it could be archived, and because she did that very well before she died. Honey Lee was very important in the magazine On Our Backs, which was a magazine about lesbian sexuality that dealt with SM and the whole spectrum, and some very important work that I lived in DC, so I had worked with Off Our Backs, and then On Our Backs came along, and as you know, there was a lot of controversy in our community about whether bookstores would carry it. And then there were the whole sex wars, which really divided the community in a terrible way.
What about relationships with filmmakers? Like, did you ever interact with Barbara Hammer?
Well, when I was part of a collective called Iris Films, we split, and then I was part of another organization called Moonforce Media. And what we did was we put together these film packages, and we sent them all over the country. It was, and Barbara Hammer's films, of course, were like central to this endeavor. And it was really kind of amazing what we did, because we had this package of short films, because mostly that's all people could afford to make at the time. So it would all together, Donna Deitch and Jan Oxenberg and Barbara Hammer, and it would make a package. And the films were very heavy, these big film containers that we would mail out to people. And then we would teach them how to rent a hall, how to do a press release, how to get, how to do a film showing in their community. So that was my first connection with Barbara Hammer.
So, I mean, one of the things that I'm getting from what you're saying is that one of the ways of getting your work out was to literally travel to all these subcultural spots around the country and actually show your slides.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
But also at the time, there was the huge women in print movement. There were so many women's and lesbian newspapers. Every city had at least one. Mm-hmm. There were women's presses. There was writing centers, like Casanova had a lesbian writing program. So how would you get your photographs into the lesbian press or the women's press?
Mostly the presses came to me. They wanted covers for their books. The publications that were on newsprint, of which there were also many, I had, for a long time, I never saw my pictures on anything except cheap newsprint. So when I would get a book cover, that was very exciting because it would look, better. And I was very hooked into the women in print movement, in part because at the time my lover was running a bookstore. And so
In DC?
in
Was that
DC, Llamas,
Right.
Mary Farmer. And Mary and a number of other people were the organizers of 2 of the Women in Print conferences, which were so amazing, that happened in DC at the 4-H Club, and brought together, everybody. It felt like, Audre, Adrienne, and Kitchen Table announced that they were formed at one of the Women in Print conferences. All the bookstore owners, all the Barbara Greer, and the people from Persephone and Naiad, and it was such a wonderful movement, the Women in Print movement, and I was very, I knew most of the people, and but they wouldn't print eye to eye because cost too much. Cost too much. Yeah, so that's why I self-published.
In Eye to Eye, there's quite a few Black women also Black couples. There's a Black couple in your book, and mother and daughter images. And it's interesting, I've been talking to Amy Horowitz, who at the time was Bernice Reagan's partner, and they ran music festivals in Washington, D.C. And it seems like the lesbian community in Washington, D.C. was a little bit ahead in terms of, interracial events and having some kind of race consciousness at the time. Do you think that that's true, or am I being romantic?
I think you have to remember that at the time, Washington was a majority Black city. However, there was still enormous separation between the, Sister Fire and the Sweet Honeys and everything. That was a little later, actually. And I think things got a little better. But the collective I was in, the Furies, in the early 70s, that was an all-white collective. And we had consciousness about racism, which is one of the reasons I have a fair number of women of color, BIPOC people in my book, because my consciousness was there. But in actuality, in terms of our social lives, they were still very segregated for a long time, honestly.
Right. Okay, so I just want to say, if anyone has any questions, they can put them in the chat, and we're going to keep talking. Okay. So, Jeb, when your book came out, how did you get it out there? Like, did you try to get the straight press to cover it? Did you try to get the photography press to cover it?
No, I didn't try. I just assumed they wouldn't. I got the Naiad and Persephone to share their distribution network with me in terms of actually, having it in a warehouse somewhere and being able to send it out and that sort of thing. In terms of the reviews, some regular photography press, like After Image, did review it, but 90% of in general, I was not going to waste my time trying to convince the straight world to pay attention, because I had made the book for my own lesbian community, and all my energy went into making sure that they knew about it. And the first printing was 5,000 books, which is big for any photography book, and it was gone in 3 months. And then we did another printing that was gone, and it just speaks to the enormous hunger for this sort of imagery that existed in the community at that time.
Now, people are asking to see more of your photographs. Now, you and I collaborated on a photograph. Should we show that one from 1982?
Yes, we should show that.
Okay.
That would be number 24.
Okay.
And this is when we get into the kind of photojournalism that I was talking about earlier. And you were over being grabbed by the policeman. Do you want to tell what was happening?
Okay, so there was an anti-abortion hearing in Congress for something called the Human Life Amendment that would have made all forms of birth control and abortion illegal. And it was, and no one who supported abortion rights was allowed to testify. So a group of us called ourselves the Women's Liberation ZAP Action Brigade. That's me on the left there. In the center is Stephanie Roth, and on the right is Karen Zimmerman. And we came down, and this was the time of live television. And we came down to this event, and we knew that we were going to disrupt it. So Casey DeJanicus of On Our Backs tipped off JEB.
Off our backs.
Off our backs, sorry. Tipped off JEB, who situated herself perfectly 2 rows ahead. Now, the Black woman here in front of me, that's Mildred Jefferson, who was the head of National Right to Life at the time. And so I remember when we stood, you know, what happened was somebody was testifying and they said, a fetus is an astronaut in a uterine spaceship. And at that point, we jumped up on these chairs and we yelled, a woman's life is a human life. And I remember Jeb just jumping up and taking this picture. And I smiled for you, Jeb. Yeah. And I was arrested there by that guy named Billy Joe Pickett, who testified in court that we said ladies should be able to choose. But it was on live TV on all 3 channels. So thank you so much for capturing that moment, Jeb. I really appreciate that. Okay.
Well, we want to see 25, please, because there it is.
Right, it's the cover of my reissue of my book, right? There it is.
An important book, I might add.
Thank you, Jeb.
I'm very honored to be part of it.
I'm thrilled to have proof that I was on it early. So we have a question for you from Aaliyah. Where did your courage come from to be yourself, to show yourself, to share these stories?
You know, I was raised in a home that was a liberal home that believed in fairness, and I just had some, you know, inherent desire for there to be justice. And part of that is, if you're a lesbian, as I was, because I had the feelings, you know, I knew I loved women. I mean, that was a physical thing that I understood. And I also understood that I was not supposed to love women, that was a bad thing as far as the society was concerned. So I actually lived in the closet for 6 years. And that is a horrible experience. And I just got to the point where I couldn't stand not being who I was. And I don't know that I would call it brave as much as I would call it, I just had to do it. Do you know what I mean? It didn't feel to me like being a lesbian was a choice, even though that's what we said in the Furies. I never believed it. I knew that's who I was, and I never felt that that was terrible, because it meant I loved somebody, and love is not a bad thing. And I never believed that loving anybody, regardless of who they were, was a bad thing.
Well, also, when you're in the closet, you're alone. And when you come out into a vibrant subculture, you're not alone anymore.
Well, there was no vibrant subculture. I had to build a vibrant
That's right.
subculture. But that was what I wanted to do. You know, I was one of the lesbians who recruited. I went up to New York to recruit lesbians to come back to DC, so there would be other lesbians. You know,
How did you do that?
Well, I went to the Black Panther Party Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and these radical lesbians, calling themselves radical radishes, they jumped up, you know, to protest the fact that lesbians were being left out of the new Constitution. And I ran after them, and I ran into the bathroom after them and cornered them and found out who they were and where they were. And then I went up to New York and I said, you know, you should come down to DC. We've got a lot of good things going on, which wasn't true, but they came, and that's that was the beginning.
Okay, so now I want to talk about preservation for the future.
Yes.
So now you've been very involved with Smith College. You've had, your papers are there, and you've done an extensive oral history. Can you let people know a little bit about how you made preparations for that, and how you made the decision, and how you chose Smith?
Well, as I said, Tee told me I better get going, I knew my work was important. I wanted it to be preserved. I wanted it to be in good shape. And so I shopped it around to a couple of places, you know, university archives, and did not get a good response. And the reason I ended up giving it to Smith was because they came to me and they said, would I be part of something called, I'm blanking on the name, but it was, they had gotten a grant to do oral histories of marginalized groups, working class women, lesbians, BIPOC women. And so they sent Kelly Anderson, who is a trained, wonderful oral historian, down to do an oral history with me. And then they invited me up to be on a program. And then they really convinced me that they were one of the premier women's history archives and that I should put my work there. And by then, you know, we had a relationship. And also, I went to college in that same valley in Western Massachusetts, so it felt familiar. And I think it was called Voices of something. Is somebody going to give me the name? Anyway, yes, I think I answered your question, but I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
Because I've been talking. I want to say that you did 200 oral histories that are the basis of your new book, which is the definitive history of ACT UP.
ACT UP New York, yeah.
ACT UP New York. And how do you do 200 oral histories?
Well, it took Jim Hubbard and I 18 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how we did it.
Okay, but I want you to tell everyone why oral history is so important.
Okay, thank you. Well, if you've ever been at an event and then you've seen the way it's covered, you know the difference between representation and reality. And especially with a movement like ACT UP, where so many people died, and that it existed before the internet revolution. So when everyone suddenly was online, ACT UP had not been digitized, and there really was no data for people to understand what had happened. There was quite a bit of video, but hadn't been preserved, and it wasn't in circulation. So in 2001, Jim Hubbard and I started the ACT UP Oral History Project, which people can go to. It's at actuporalhistory.org. And we just started interviewing rank and file members of ACT UP, and we let people decide if they were eligible. We had no eligibility requirements, and it was different. And we made all the transcripts available for free at our website, and today we've had 14 million hits.
Wow.
So quite a few people have looked at that material. And our hope was that we would create the data and somebody out there would cohere it or analyze it, but it never really happened. You know, people didn't read the interviews carefully, and then some bad representation started to come out, which I'm not going to say the titles of, but that eliminated women and people of color from representation, and we couldn't live with that. So after a few years of talking it over, I decided that I would write the book that would really include everybody. So my book, I talk about 140 activists. It's the full range of the nexus of the movement, of which ACT UP was just an organizational part. So it's mothers and prisoners and Haitians and drug users and, you know, everybody who was part of the AIDS Coalition at the time. And it took about 3 years of rereading everything and cohering what the themes were, and now there's the book. And I also have 60 photographs, most of which people have not seen before, because I wrote to people and said, you have photographs that no one's ever seen, and they sent me incredible, absolutely wonderful photographs. So I'm very excited about all of it. So that's my answer, but I have to get back to you because people
No, I have one follow-up. I'm allowed a follow-up.
Okay, go ahead.
Why is it important for us to understand history?
Well, in terms of activist history, I mean, I focused on ACT UP because it's a movement that was in part successful. And, you know, because I was in a movement that did change the world, not completely, but for the better, I know that it can be done. And I felt that it was very important to cohere how they did it and also what mistakes they made. And to lay all that out, not as a work of nostalgia, but for contemporary activists and people who want change, because I think people today desperately want change. One of the differences between the lesbian movement, which I was also part of, and ACT UP, and this was something that I learned from hearing T. Grace Atkinson speak many years ago. She said that women can only move forward when men move forward. And in periods where men are regressive, women can position, they can create ideas, they can foreground visions of the future, but the society as a whole cannot move forward only if women see the potential. And that's a bitter pill to swallow, but I will say that in my life, I've seen that. And when I first came into ACT UP, I mean, Alexandra Juhasz says it's the meeting of principle and privilege for the first time in a room. And that combination is really what helped that movement move forward.
Yeah.
So a couple of things people have asked. They've asked if you have any comments about Diana Davies or Ellen Chomsky, and these were two other photographers that people were interested in.
Yes, those are wonderful photographers who actually did work before I did. And Diana Davies was particularly important to me because there was a point at which Diana Davies had done a lot of photography of the Black Civil Rights Movement. And there was an exhibit of work about the Black Civil Rights Movement in the Smithsonian Institution just when I was getting started. And I said to myself, wow, someday they're going to have to show our movement in the Smithsonian. I better make sure they're going to have good photographs of it. And, you know, Diana did a lot of work within the lesbian movement, and her work, along with another early lesbian photographer, Kate Tobin LaHusen, both of their works are at the New York Public Library, and you can see a lot of it digitized online. Ellen Shumsky, to me, is very well known because she has the iconic picture of a women's consciousness raising group, which was a very hard thing to get photographed because they were very private and people didn't want to be photographed. It was almost like the feminist women's liberation equivalent of the bars. You know, this is our safe space. You don't bring a camera in here. But Ellen Shumsky did that. So that was good. And she also, I think, you can tell me if I'm right, was one of the photographers of the Lavender Menace when they disrupted the Now conference by ripping off their shirts and saying, you know, had their Lavender Menace t-shirts. And those are some also very important, great pictures. So yes, both of them and Kate Tobin are important.
Now, here's a controversial question, Jeb. What do you think of contemporary lesbian work, and do you follow it?
Well, I do follow it, especially once I figured out Instagram, because Instagram is the most wonderful gallery of work of all kinds of photographers. But of course, I'm going to shout out to my buddy Lola Flash, who does incredible work that shows us, especially Black LGBTQ people all over the world. I follow a lot of people. I'm not going to name all the names because it's a very long list, but I do think a lot of important new work is happening. I also think a lot of work that's happening now is not very interesting because people, you know, are just photographing young white couples together. That isn't so interesting to me.
Okay. Now, this is also an important question.
Mm-hmm.
We are dependent on young scholars for historicizing our work in the future. And what advice do you have for people who are interested in the 70s and 80s so that people are not constantly bombarding you and asking you the same questions, but if they really want to understand the period for future research?
Well, I wanted to say this before about oral histories. I want Debbie to put up the information about how to do oral histories, because I think before all of us who were alive in the 70s and 80s are gone, we should do a heck of a lot more oral histories. And you can do oral histories with each other. And then there are places you can put them, because that first person narrative, as you know, Sarah was saying, we need that. We need not just to be focusing on a few people and the leaders and the influencers, whatever they're called these days, and do what Sarah did and make sure you have the real people who were doing the real work, telling their stories. That's what's important. So if you are any age, start doing oral histories with people who are older. Do it. If you're old, do it with each other. If you're younger, do it with somebody old. But let's get all those stories told while we have a chance, because that's a very important part of history, I think.
Now, somebody asked a question about nudity. Okay, now we're in a period where anyone can go online and see anything that they want, right?
No,
But
you can't see women's nipples. You can't see women's nipples on Facebook and Instagram. It's ridiculous.
okay, well, so how did you negotiate shooting your subjects in terms of nudity?
Well, I started by not using the language of shooting and capturing and telling myself that I needed a different language so that my mind was in the right place, where I was making a picture with somebody else in a collaborative way. We could look at number 20. Back in 1980, I wrote my theory of photography, which was how it was a collaboration between the photographer and the person being photographed, who I called the muse, because I did not want to say that was my subject, because that's already objectifying, and that we would create something together. And then, the movement was the source of everything. And then I would share it with the viewer and so on. But in terms of nudity, I never asked anybody. That's good. That's enough of that thing. But if you want to read more about it, Debbie's going to tell you where it comes from. I never ever asked anybody to take their clothes off. I basically never asked anybody to do anything. I saw my job as being there to record what would have happened if I wasn't there, as much as possible. But there was a lot of nudity back then. There just was. And as you said, because women were living on the land and there were places we could be safely nude, there was a lot of nudity. So if people were nude, I would say, is it okay for me to photograph you while you're nude? And if they said yes, I said, well, would you like me to be nude too? Because I felt that would, again, equalize the power balance more, would be less predatory, And yeah, I mean, the truth is, there really aren't that many nude pictures. It just seems like it to people because we don't see nude pictures that are not, exploitative and fake.
So we're coming to the end of the hour, but if I'm going to say, save my hardest question for the end, but people, please keep posting and we'll go back to your questions. So, the lesbian culture, subculture that you so lovingly represented and has proven to be so important to so many people was really a utopian movement in some senses. And I remember at the time feeling that it was just going to grow and grow and grow. And we would become more and more free and the world would see us and we would change the world. And actually it feels like the world changed us more than, or perhaps a little bit of each. And so what is your feeling about that looking back? Where do you think it shifted, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree. We had a very utopian vision. And, we thought if women could be together and women could be in power, that would basically solve all the problems. And it was heartbreaking. I was purged from the Furies, there was a lot of things that happened that were not very utopian. And that was on a personal level. But I think what happened in general, and I think I agree with a lot of what you have said previously about this, was that we started as a liberation movement. We didn't have the word intersectional, but we were anti-racist. We were socialists. We had a vision that, you know, transcended just making things better for LGBTQ people. And at some point, the movement divided into what we used to call the suits and the streets, you know, the organizations who became professional and got funded and were really much more single issue kind of movement. And, you know, Audre told us we're not single issue people. We shouldn't have a single issue movement, but we did. And that led to all the kinds of, you know, assimilationist politics and commodification and, you know, loss of the liberationist spirit because, you know, we went, I think you expressed it as, you know, we went from a movement to a brand, you know, that people were just wanted to market to us. They didn't pay any attention to us until they could sell us back our own culture, you know, after it had been kind of put through a strainer. So all the real, you know, juicy parts were gone.
Well, I want to end on an upbeat note because,
okay,
you know, when you look at all the movements that are out there today,
yeah,
that are in the streets together, there are queer women in leadership of every one of those movements. Black Lives Matter, the Dreamers, Palestine Solidarity, wherever you're looking. And this idea that, you know, we have to hide from the rest of the world or that they won't let us in, whatever, is over.
Yep.
And that's very, very exciting. And I'm hoping that, and, you know, even we now have some very cool young women of color in Congress who are very radical and who thought that would ever happen. And so perhaps we're headed towards a new kind of movement in this country, especially for queer people, where we can be part of everything and we're not the weak link in the coalition. And all different kinds of people are out there in a big tent movement. And so that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yes.
And
I think we're on that path. I think that the uprisings of the past year made a big difference. I think our own so-called LGBTQ movements now understand that we have to be looking at housing and immigration rights and healthcare and climate change, and that these are, you know, LGBTQ issues because, you know, LGBTQ people are all kinds of people. But yes, the young leadership and the fact that it is, there are so many visionary, tough, wonderful, young, Black and BIPOC LGBTQ leaders in all kinds of movements is gives me so much hope. I am actually very hopeful at this point. I agree.
I think we should end there. Thank you, Jeb. So
Thank
exciting
you.
to have this opportunity. And everyone,
Sarah.
this is your chance to get a signed copy of the reissue of Jeb's important book. So thank you all.
Thank you both. And as I mentioned, this will be a recorded event. So this link that you're finding the live stream at right now will be available into eternity. So you can go to the link there to watch it if you missed any part of it. Also, the chat will be available so you can see all of these wonderful links that Jeb has mentioned throughout the talk. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.